All right, so I'm hoping that folks can hear me. We're going to start the webinar on crisis communication. So welcome and good afternoon to the NABCAR Crisis Communications Planning webinar series. It will include 3 webinars, today's followed by 2 others on consecutive Wednesdays in March, the 1st and the 8th. Today's is titled Getting Started, offering you things to do and think about as you begin to write or review your crisis plan. Before we begin, I wanted to address a few housekeeping notes. Again, this webinar is one of a series of 3 planned to address crisis communication planning. Each webinar will be about 1 hour. However, if there are lots of questions and if attendees don't mind, we may stay on longer to address them. If you have a question, please type it in the chat window in the lower right corner of the screen. At the end of the presentation, I will come back and ask the questions for the presenter, Carol Gorney, to answer them. Also, if you think of any questions after the first webinar has ended, feel free to email me. You should have my email address from the announcements about the series. Your question may be addressed via email or responded to at the next webinar for everyone's benefit. This presentation is being recorded, and we hope to be able to make it available for playback later. This concludes the announcements for today. Now a brief intro about Carol Gorney. Carol is a nationally recognized expert in media relations and crisis management and communication. She has been a consultant to government, corporate, and nonprofit organizations, including the defense contractor Lockheed Martin, and the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency, for whom she developed a 3-day workshop on environmental crisis planning for use worldwide. She is accredited by the Public Relations Society of America and is a member of its prestigious College of Fellows. Thank you for listening and enjoy the webinar. Carol, I'm now going to change presenter and give you controls. So you have the screen, Carol.
Okay. Make sure that
I see you.
You see me?
I see
okay.
you.
Okay. Good afternoon, and thank you all for being here today and for participating. And I want to thank NABCA for making this possible. I'm having some difficulty here.
You're not able to advance?
I can't get the, no, I can't get that. Yeah, it's not going. There we are. Okay, are you seeing that without the bar on the side?
Yes, and you're at an overview.
Okay, the problem is it's covering part of my slide, and I can't get rid of it.
Okay, can you continue?
Yes, okay. As Maggie said, this is the first in a series of 3 webinars. I want to emphasize that it's not only about planning, but also we will be covering a lot of strategies and tactics that you can embed into your planning to help you better prepare for public and media interaction. And along the line, we're going to talk about public hostility and some of the minefields of social media. Webinar number 1, Getting Started, was what we're going to do today, and I'm just going to go over this very quickly. We're going to talk about why it's necessary, the categories and types of potential crises, what are your specific risks and how to try to determine that, how crisis levels are defined and determined, and why planning by crisis level rather than just by a general crisis is essential. And finally, we're going to cover a lot today about what an effective crisis communication plan should include. Webinar number 2, Preparing for Media and Public Communication. Just real quickly, we're going to deal with some much more on social media strategies and tactics and policies and procedures, responding to reporters' questions, and media guidelines, and that includes spokespersons, selecting your spokespersons, and so forth. And finally, webinar 3, we will talk about organizing and actually writing the plan. I'm telling you today a lot about what needs to be in the plan. and we will talk about organizing it, and you will get to see some actual templates for different kinds of crisis scenarios that are appropriate to you in the beverage control industry, and how to organize that and how to understand how you make different levels and what stakeholders you need to consider at various levels of severity, and you'll see how all of that gets put together. So anyway, so let's get started with the first one. I'm going to start by making a statement that communication is vital to crisis management. I can't think of anything. One of the problems that I often see is that there'll be crisis management or crisis response plans done, but they don't talk about communicating with the public or communicating with the media. They're more logistical. They're more about who tells who and inside the organization. We've seen many examples of how poor communication or no communication can make a crisis situation or potential crisis even worse. It focuses more attention on the situation. It can actually become an additional crisis on its own, giving the initial crisis much longer life, and also allowing others, when a vacuum is created, others are able to step in and control the conversation or even speak for your organization or for the issue, which is something that you certainly don't want. An example of some of what I'm just talking about, if you remember the British Petroleum Deepwater disaster out in the Gulf, well, Time magazine ran an article kind of summarizing all of the gaffes, communication gaffes that CEO Tom Hayward made, which made the situation even worse, made the spill an even worse story and kept it going. And some of the things he did in the New York Times, he said, "What the hell did we do to deserve this?" Well, he's kind of placing blame. He's saying, well, we didn't do all this. Why? It's, you know, the media is doing this to us. He told The Guardian in London that the oil spill was relatively minor, and also another media that the environmental impact will be very modest. Well, he broke another rule, which is in crisis communication, which is to minimize the situation when that's not warranted. And then he probably the one you remember the most, the one that got him the most coverage, was his statement that I would like my life back. Now I have to kind of apologize for him, because in reality, that statement, I would like my life back, was taken out of context and made to make him look much more callous than what the actual situation was. I saw the entire interview, and what he was saying was that he was responding to media questions about why it was taking so long to clean up and why it was taking so long to find out what happened. And they were in essence insinuating that the company was deliberately dragging their feet. And he was saying, why would we do that? I would like my life back. And so he really wasn't, it was really taken out of context from what his real meaning was. But it proves a point about communication in crisis, and that is you have to be very careful. You have to plan what you're going to say, and you have to stick to messaging. You can't kind of go off the cuff and say whatever comes to mind. And this is a classic example of that. Some goals of crisis communication. Why do we go to all this trouble? Why do we do this? Well, it helps you provide factual and timely information to satisfy the public's need to know. And the public, more and more with all of the internet and online news services and whatever, it is very important that you get your point of view out and your information to the public in a timely manner. You can also reduce risks for people if there's something, for example, if you have product contamination, you need to get the word out. This helps people decide what to do to avoid the risk, to avoid drinking something that might have a contamination. In terms of issues, it helps improve understanding of those issues or of the situation. And all of these things combined help maintain the organization's reputation and credibility. And that ultimately is what we are doing in all of this planning types of efforts. Now, I'm going to talk about the benefits of planning both before, during, and after a crisis, because they do exist. Before, part of the whole benefit of planning is that you get to identify risks, as we talked about earlier. And because you've been able to identify those risks, there's a possibility that you are able to avoid it, to at least minimize the chances that it will happen. It also helps you resolve differences of opinion and make sure that everybody is in agreement and on the same page as far as how you're going to deal with particular situations, what you're going to communicate, who you're going to communicate to. The time to fight those arguments and to have those differences of opinion are not during the crisis, when time is really limited and you're under the gun and maybe not thinking quite as rationally, a little more emotional, a little more harried. The time to do it is before anything happens. One of the areas that this particularly applies to is in the legal area, where very often your attorneys will tell you, oh, we shouldn't be talking, we shouldn't be saying anything. Well, that's not good advice, and you need to fight the battles of what you could say in any situation beforehand. During the crisis, the reason for planning ahead is that it improves speed and quality of responses. Obviously, if you're not having to deal with a lot of conflict during the situation, you're going to be able to respond to it much more sensibly. Reduces confusion and conflict. And one of the things that happens when you're not communicating or you're taking too long to communicate, you create a vacuum, and that vacuum gets filled up with rumors and speculation. The media love to speculate. Other people love to speculate as to what happened or how it happened or why it happened. This in turn, if people think nobody's in charge and nobody knows what's going on because you're not communicating, the public becomes fearful. And the difference between fear and hostility is very, very close. And that's very often the origin of the hostility. And again, communicating better because of planning helps maintain and even enhance your reputation and credibility. Afterwards, the benefits of planning are that the plan gives you a basis for evaluating and making changes, okay? Once you have put the plan in place, once you've had the situation, you've dealt with it according to the plan, you can then go back and look at it and say, did we do it the right way? Or is there something we should do differently? You could even ask the media. I know this sounds pretty excessive, but you could even go to the media and say, how did we do? Did we communicate well? What could we have done better? What would you suggest? And then make whatever changes you think are reasonable in your plan. Planning afterward also demonstrates concrete efforts to anticipate and reduce negative situations. And let me jump down to the last one here. It can help you mitigate legal penalties, the good old penalties that you pay for not just the cost of the losses, but the punitive damages that are expected, and those can be in the millions of dollars. If you can show that you tried your best, that you were planned for it, that you did everything that you could, it helps mitigate those kinds of reactions. Your attorney may tell you, well, don't say anything because it can be used against you in a court of law. It's true. But not communicating and the fact that you didn't communicate can be used against you in a court of law also. And very often that kind of situation will persuade juries that you are arrogant or that you think you're above the law or whatever. If you look at McDonald's and that coffee spill a number of years ago, the huge punitive damages they took, and the jury all said we did it because they were so arrogant and they didn't care about the victim. Okay, we've talked about the benefits and why we need to plan. So now we're going to get started and consider everything that could happen. I want to make the point that when you plan for crisis, you can't plan for something really general. You can't say, if we have an emergency, we will do this and this and this. You have to be specific about the emergencies or the potential crisis that you're talking about. One way to do that is to look, you can find these lists just about any place in textbooks or anywhere, and you can make up your own. Think in terms of categories: operational, employment, and labor, and some others that I'll show you in a minute. And then under each of those categories are specific types. Okay, so you can use these as a guide. Do any of these things apply to you? Okay, and when we go into environmental, I'm not sure about that. If you have toxic or leaks or anything that could affect the environment, but certainly health and safety, product contamination, work conditions, employee deaths, accidents, workplace violence. If you have stores, you're likely to have armed robberies or break-ins. That's a potential. If you look under legal, criminal, and regulatory, you've got thefts, you've got lawsuits, and of course natural disasters, which depending on where you're located, whether you have blizzards or tornadoes or floods or lightning strikes, those are all. And these are not only just in terms of their effect on your facilities or even on your employees being able to get to work or whatever. You may also, we'll be talking about this when we talk about policies and procedures next week. You may also have to deal with how do you deal with losses that your employees suffer from these kinds of situations. Okay, and finally, security and terrorism. I would like to, more than likely, you're not going to be the victim of a real well-planned terrorist attack from outside, but you might have a domestic terrorism. Bomb threats fall under this category of security, and they're happening all the time. Most of the time, the media don't cover bomb threats because they lend themselves to copycats. But in Pennsylvania, every time a school shuts down because it gets a bomb threat, you have media cars out there, you have the helicopters flying around overhead. So depending on how your media in your area cover bomb threats, you need to plan for that. You've got other things, product tampering, cyber attacks, okay? Those are happening more and more. If you have customers, they could get your customers' credit cards, those types of things. All right, so we've talked about a whole bunch of different kinds of potential situations, crises, but how do you know which risks to include in your plan that you should be concerned about? All right, well, here's some suggestions. You can look at your organization's history. All right, what has happened before? And maybe not even just what actually happened, but did you have any close calls where maybe you got lucky? This next time you might not get lucky. Maybe it's something you've been ignoring, you really should have taken care of, but you didn't. You can start there. It's a good place to start. You're probably not going to need to do a formal risk assessment. That's usually reserved for water systems or electric plants, power plants, and so forth. But you can look at past experiences of similar organizations like yourself and some of your sister organizations in other control states and other alcohol beverage control areas. You can also look at vulnerabilities in related industries or in just other kinds of organizations, regardless of whether they're specific to your kind of thing. But there are a lot of types of crises that happen to everybody. Sexual harassment charges, allegations happen any place you have employees, okay? So you can look at some of that. What's been in the news? And you find that sometimes crises change. We're now seeing a lot of workplace violence and other things like that. So you need to keep up, because often things that you never would have thought of being a problem before might now be becoming, like the cyber hacking that 10 years ago nobody talked about that. We weren't concerned about that. Okay. And by talking to your employees, and I'll get into that in a little more detail as we go through today. All right, look beyond the ordinary. Prepare for more than just risks that are characteristic of your own industry. There are all kinds of things that happen to everybody. I just mentioned workplace violence, shootings, computer hacking, cyber, social media attacks. It's not out of the realm of possibility. You get people who set up these phony sites called, you know, alcohol beverage control sucks.com, you know, whatever. And they put out all kinds of things. When BP was in its crisis, there actually was a site that posted really insensitive comments about the people in the area that was affected by the spill, and it made it look like it was coming from BP, and it actually got picked up by the traditional media, and they actually published it. So there are all kinds of concerns that you need to think about, and again, bomb threats, as I mentioned before. When you're assessing risks, look at two different things. Look at internal factors that can affect you, and look at external factors. All right, under internal, you've got employee dissatisfaction. Maybe there's an issue that your employees are unhappy about that's been festering for a while and nothing's been done about it. And somebody decides to go online, go on social media and post, and they can do, a lot of these can be done anonymously. So you need to think about that. If you've got budget cutbacks coming up, you've got potential for accidents, management decisions that might make people unhappy, either internally, and lack of policies that you need to that need to be either improved on or reviewed or added. In the external factors, you've got whether we saw that earlier, politics, problems with suppliers and vendors, social media campaigns, and activists. These could be people, for example, one of the things that's floating around today is the people that want to get rid of all government agencies. They want to cut government, and they want to, you know, get rid of this agency and get rid of that, and you might find yourself the victim of that, and that could become something that you would have to deal with. Prioritizing risk. Once you've got an idea of what you might be vulnerable to, you need to decide what is the likelihood of it happening. Is it possible, credible? Has it already happened? And how immediate is it? Is it likely to happen this year or next year or within 5 years or whatever? And you need to try to assess that. Now, how do you go about doing that? I suggest developing a survey checklist. You can do it like Excel with a column. We put the crisis on the left side, and then put choices like very likely, likely, not so likely, however you want to word that or however you want to judge that. And then you can check off the boxes next to each of the potential risks that you're looking at. I suggest that you also ask your employees to check what they think is likely or not likely and explain the choices, why they chose very likely if they do, and ask them to list any risks that are not on the list. Now, each one of you is going to be different in terms of relationships with employees and how much you can involve them in things like this. But it is true that employees, especially those working closest to the operations and doing the daily, day-to-day stuff, are often in a situation where they are able to evaluate, or whether they're sensitive to things that might happen that you might not be aware of. In fact, they might actually know of some situations that they've been afraid to share or been afraid to report for fear it might work badly against them. So this could be an approach that would be very helpful to you. What you may learn are vulnerabilities you didn't know you had, or negative perceptions that you need to deal with. And perceptions, as we say in the business, perception is reality. And you may have either people in the public that they come in contact with, or themselves might have perceptions that could be harmful to you in the long run. Okay, don't forget about issues. Issues undetected or unresolved can develop into crises themselves. This is often, we see definitions of crisis as being an unexpected occurrence or event. We usually think of it in terms of a fire or an explosion or a flood or some big major event, where actually many crises and many things that get a lot of negative publicity have to do with issues and unresolved or undetected issues. Mishandling of emergencies. You may have an event, but if you don't handle it right, you don't communicate about it right, that can exacerbate the situation, and that in itself can become a crisis, much like I was talking about the BP comments that were made by the CEO. In managing issues, issues are in some cases the most or the worst crisis to manage, and that's because they're easy to ignore. You can't ignore fire, but you can ignore an issue. They tend to have a long life in people's minds and in the media, and if they get discussed on social media or online, the likelihood is they'll be there for years. It's very hard to get rid of that. Issues often involve accusations that are very hard to disprove. Try to disprove the negative. It's so much easier to make accusations about people or things, and very, very hard to deny it or to convince people that it's not true. And it may involve hard to change opinions or perceptions rather than facts. And perceptions, opinions, those are all, once people have expressed an opinion about something, it's very, very difficult to get them to change. Okay, so we've talked about why we need to plan. We've talked about how to assess some of the risk and so forth. The next step is, how bad can it get? And by that, I mean levels of severity. It's not enough to just say, okay, we're going to have this event or we're going to have this situation. You also have to look at levels of severity for that particular crisis. And you can read this. There are a number of factors, including the impact that it has on your organization, the potential impact. We deal with levels 1 through 3 or 4, with 3 or 4 being the most severe crises, okay? And one thing that I want you to keep in mind, and we will we will be dealing with this in great detail on the third webinar. We'll show you how you go from level 1 to level 2 to level 3. But keep in mind that a level 1 crisis can easily escalate to a level 3 or 4 as developments occur. And crises can actually skip levels. They don't all start at 1. You might actually start at 3 or 4 at the highest level. And again, our examples of BP, the oil rig, started at the highest level to begin with because of the number of employee deaths, the environmental impacts, the business loss, the reputation loss. And Volkswagen is another one. They've had 11 million diesel vehicles with software to cheat the emissions test. Okay, well, this was an issue crisis of credibility and honesty and business ethics and so forth. They had all these recalls that they had to do. The sales impact was huge. The reputation and brand impact was huge. And so these were examples of crises that started right up at the top. All right, here's some factors that determine crisis levels that you need to keep in mind. And when you're writing your scenarios, you put some of these into each of the scenarios as you move up to the severity, to the highest severity level. Has to do with the number of injuries or deaths, property damage, impact on reputation and relationships, customer and public relationships, involvement of outside entities, and you'll see in a minute how that works, political fallout, and I want to talk about past history. Okay, if you've had a similar situation in the past, even if it was 10 or 15 years ago, because often the media will go back and find these things, and then covering your story, they'll mention that, well, it just happened to happen 10 or 15 years ago, same thing, or something similar. The problem with that is that the first time something happens to you, and there's some doubt about your credibility, your responsibility for it. You know, was it something you really could have avoided? The public usually give you the benefit of the doubt. But if you've had a similar circumstance or situation, and now you're going through it again, they're going to believe that you are at fault, that it's your problem, and you should have done something about it. So it's very important, especially when you're doing your risk assessments, again, to look at your past history and make sure that you are aware of that, and don't try, you can't hide the fact that you've already had that situation. All right, crisis level definitions. I'm not going to read this to you, but you can look at it. You're going to have your own copy. Level 1 and level 2 and level 3, 4, part of what determines that is the amount of outside help that you need to get. At level 1, you can handle it pretty much internally by yourself. Levels 2 and 3, you need outside help, and 3 and 4 are usually a lot of outside help, and this is the area where you need to have full participation of your crisis management and your crisis communication teams, and we'll talk about those in a little bit. Why is it important to plan by crisis levels? Part of the reason is that one size doesn't fit all, okay? And what do I mean by that? I mean that as the levels increase, as they get more severe, who gets notified and who you have to contact, and the communication requirements and so forth get broader and expand. The number of stakeholders widen, and management of the situation becomes much more complicated. It usually involves many more outside people. And the minute that you call the fire department or you call the police department, you can guarantee that the media will be on hearing the call and will be at the scene if it's anything that they think is worthwhile, newsworthy. Okay, management becomes complicated, and at this point, you're probably going to have to activate your crisis management and your crisis communication teams. All right. Planning, you hear this all the time. Everybody says you need to plan for the worst case scenario. If you haven't planned for that, you haven't really planned. And the person who said that is me, okay? If you plan for the worst case scenario, and that is the level 3 or 4, chances are you'll be able to deal, if you can deal with that one, you can deal with anything else that happens of a lesser nature. And you're not going to be planning for every single solitary situation and contingency that comes along. That's ridiculous. You can't do that. But if you plan for enough related types of situations at the highest level, you're going to be prepared for just about anything. You will be able to mix and match, and you'll be able to take most of what you've planned for one thing and apply it to something else. All right, so we've talked about severity, we talked about levels. Now we talk about additional planning steps that involve who's in charge, and that's your crisis teams. And I mentioned earlier that we have, I don't know what you call them, people call them different things, crisis management team, CMT, or crisis response team, or whatever, it doesn't matter, but you understand basically what that is. The crisis communication team, and again, as I said, many plans do not include crisis communication. Whoever your communication person is, public relations, whatever you call them, corporate communications, or public information, whatever that position is part of, and usually the leader of that team. It doesn't necessarily have to be really large. It might be 2 or 3 people, but the team will more than likely have to bring in support staff from other positions and other departments in order to help in a really serious situation. And those are the things you plan for ahead of time. Okay, so your plan includes membership lists by names and titles for both of those committees. Who's going to be who's potentially going to be on that committee? What are their names? What are their titles? What is the contact information? That includes telephones, landlines, texting, cell, whatever. The list or the plan also lists general duties by each member title. What is it that they're going to be responsible for doing if they're activated? What is the criteria for activating and deactivating the teams? And what is the name and titles and contact information for the support staff that's going to be needed? Now here's some examples. This is one possible crisis management team membership. Whoever your director is, I don't know what titles, they vary. It could be executive director, chair, whatever, CFO, COO, whatever. Your human resources is almost always on these teams and meets with the team, not just if it's a situation that involves employees directly, but also because you need to be sure that you are communicating with your employees. They're a very important public in any kind of a situation, and we'll talk about that more next week. Your communication director, of course, any external and internal communication managers that you might have, an executive secretary or assistant. You need someone who can keep records on the meetings and so forth. There may be reports you have to file with regulatory agencies or whatever, and it's important that you have all that stuff documented. Legal counsel, maybe, maybe not, depends. Some organizations want to do that, others do not, and so forth. Policy advisors and so forth. Now, all of those people are not going to necessarily be on at every meeting or on every committee. Again, it depends. They're the group to choose from, but it will depend on the nature of the crisis and the levels and so forth. All right, so here's some more example of how how to program this. You have the chairman, you have list his name, telephone, mobile number, and then an alternate designee. You really need to pay attention to having alternates. When I do tabletop exercises and drills, I always have the head honcho out of town, hunting up in Maine somewhere, up down east, as they say, where there are no cells, okay? Because very often that's exactly what happens when there's a crisis. They are known to happen on weekends and holidays and after hours. So be aware that you need to have people designated in case the person you need that normally would do this is not present. And then continue to add more names and contact information as you go. The crisis communication team, the communication director, again, lists name, telephone, and alternate designee. And here is a sample of the roles and responsibilities. Again, I'm not going to read them to you. I just want to point out a couple things. You see the single source down there may serve as single source through which all external information is disseminated. The communication person at some levels would more than likely be the spokesperson. If you have a situation where you have a lot of deaths, where you have the public involved to a great degree, a lot of harm or inconvenience, that kind of thing, you may want to consider that the head of your department will become the spokesperson and to show that the agency or organization is concerned, because that person represents that. In the train crash in Hoboken, New Jersey recently, Governor Christie held a news conference, and Governor Christie was the head of that and spokesperson. Other people came up and spoke about different aspects of it, but he was the head. So it's possible that in some of your states that would be the case. So you need to figure that out and find out if that is in fact what would happen, and you need to prepare for that. Okay, I'm not going to read the rest of these. You can see some of the things that are on here is making sure that the communication director needs to make sure that the team or the designated person or someone logs in calls from the media and what responses were given to them, so that you have a record of your media, and also public calls and what goes on internet and on social media if you have that. Some other additions to put in here in this section of your plan. What are the expectations? What are the requirements that you're going to make on the people who are going to be on these teams? Availability is one thing. This is a suggested one. You can change it to whatever, but in larger corporations where you have a lot of employees, or you have a situation that's very severe, you need to have people working 12-hour staggered shifts, and you need alternates, and you need support staff to do things like answering phones, IT coordination, clerical support, media monitoring, and so forth. So all of those things have to be taken into consideration. Now, I put this in because some plans that I have seen will, when you're looking at the internal and external communication protocols and requirements under each of your crisis scenarios, you will see a note that says see Appendix A for team members and contact information. That's okay, you can do that. I prefer, if you decide who exactly you want on the committee for that specific situation at that particular level, I think it's a good idea to take those people's names and contact information out and embed it in each of those sections, those crisis sections as they apply. To not do that means that you have to spend time going to another list and going through it. And I like to have plans that are all self-contained for every kind of crisis. You can take that entire section out and you have everything in it you need. You don't have to go to other documents or go to other places. That's just my recommendation. Okay, and the same thing with Appendix B for lists of stores or lists of tree information as calling tree, who calls whom, and so forth. Okay, we'll see how this embedding of these names and lists and things work when we do webinar 3. Okay. All right, so those are some of the lists. Those are the internal lists of people who are going to be involved on your teams, but there are more lists that you need to have and need to refer to. And those include the people who want to know about your situation. So you've got emergency responders lists. Those are the people that you have to call in the event of some event or emergency, fire, police, ambulance, whatever. 911 covers some of them, but if you have a county emergency management center, that probably has a different number. State police barracks have different numbers and so forth. Your chair or whoever's in charge of the crisis management team or who's in head of the agency will have to, in very severe cases, will have to notify people at a very high level, the chairman of the board, the governor, the governor's administrative assistant, and so forth. And you want to have all of that information, those lists available. Additional contacts for the chair would be regulatory agencies, if that applies, state attorney general, city officials, your local congressional delegation. I'll talk about that in a minute. Consultants that you have. If you have a crisis consultant, oftentimes people have a crisis consultant of record written into their plans so that if they need some outside assistance or help, they can call that person. Experts, people that might speak for you or might be able to help you with getting supplies or getting information, whatever you need. So all of those things, those people would probably be contacted by the chair. Why would you contact city officials or your local congressional delegation? Well, one thing that happens is when there's a major negative about some agency, it's not untoward that the media will go to those people to ask them what they think. Okay, well, it's a good idea for them to know what they think. To have some information to talk about, and they don't want to be blindsided. And if you have contacted them and advised them of what's happening, then they look better and they're more likely to be appreciative of that effort on your part. Keep in mind, though, that not everyone on the list will be called in every situation. This is a preliminary list, and from that you pull out, for this particular situation, that you should call the governor, you should call this person, whoever you think is appropriate for that particular situation. Okay, emergency contacts for the crisis management team continues. These would be just other people in the organization who would have to contact them, and that should be designated. Who calls the suppliers and the vendors, the distributors, the store managers, and so forth. I've got FEMA, Department of Transportation, the electric company. Why the electric company? If you have a power outage, you need to have somebody call the electric company to find out when the power outage will be over or what's happening, or would assume you would not be on the critical list like the water systems might be, but it's helpful to have that information available. All right. I said earlier that it's very important that you communicate with your employees, that they're a very important public, a very important stakeholder. Employees in situations crisis situations are either victims or they're critics or they're advocates, and they can be any one of those. And you need to deal with that in different ways, okay? In next week's webinar, we'll discuss employee engagement in a crisis, but I just want you to be aware that you need to have a way to contact your employees as well as these other people that we have on the list. And I'm also going to mention that you need to have next of kin information on all of your employees so that you'll be able to do that if that would be warranted if you have deaths or injuries. Okay, what else to include besides this list of emergency people and lists of people, stakeholders that you need to contact? You need to include why we are doing this, okay? And this can go, actually could go up at the beginning of your document, why you're doing it, the purpose. And here's some suggested wording. Again, I'm not going to read it all, but indicating that a crisis can happen. Why is it necessary to do a plan? Many of the things that I talked about at the beginning of this presentation. It's critical to understand that poor handling of facts and open gaps in information allow for speculation and so forth, okay? While you can't predict, this is important, while you can't predict a crisis, you can plan for communication strategy before rumors fly and stories get in the media, okay? And that begins by crafting a comprehensive strategic plan prepared in advance and put into motion when necessary. So any of these statements or all could be part of your purpose. And also, I want to stress every crisis can also be an opportunity. I spent 2 years living in China, and one of the things that I learned that I thought was amazing was that the word for crisis in Chinese is 2 characters. The first character means danger, the second character means opportunity. And I thought, how wise of the Chinese, because that is exactly the case. Even though you might have something terrible happening, it's an opportunity for you to showcase your abilities to deal with it. It's an opportunity for you to use message objectives to talk about things that you want people to know. Perhaps part of your problem was that you didn't have adequate staffing or funding. Okay, this is an opportunity to say, all right, that's the reason, and here's what we need to do about it. And it can also demonstrate your ability to manage, and you're caring for the community, you're caring for your employees, and so forth. So it is an opportunity. And finally, transparency fosters trust. Okay, so transparency has to be a key to this whole process. All right, the scope, you have purpose at the beginning, you have your scope. How far is this going to go? What are the, what is this plan going to contain? Okay, it's procedures, responsibilities for effective communication. It designates the communication teams, membership, delegates responsibilities, and procedures, specifies support staff, and so forth. So this is the scope of the plan. This is what the plan is going to do. This is what it's going to include. And differentiate among potential crises. Okay, here's an important disclaimer. It should be understood that this plan is intended to, and I can't read the rest of my part anyway, but it doesn't cover every possible crisis situation. Only those crises believed to be most likely to affect your organization have been included. Okay. It should also be recognized that every crisis might not fall within the parameters that are included in this plan. So you realize that you can't plan for everything, and you can't plan for every little contingency, but you've made an effort to at least bring out the the main parts of what you think you need to do. And it talks specifically about persons who are delegated to manage various aspects of the crisis should be authorized to do so, so that even if you can't plan for every little thing, you have authorized and empowered your people to do the right things and do what needs to be done. All right, next. Did we forget something? Yes, we forgot crisis communication facilities. All right, we have staff, we have people that we need to call, we have our statements, we have our team membership and whatever. Now we need to talk about facilities. Where will the crisis communication team meet? Where will news briefings and media interviews be held? And where will media and internet monitoring take place? I want to talk about the media briefings and interviews. It's very important that you choose places for your interviews that are neutral, that are away from where the action is. You don't want people running around behind with the camera with you standing there and all this stuff going on behind you with the cameras, okay? And you need to be prepared in the event of a real serious situation. You need to be prepared for a large number of media, because if you, depending on where you're located, you might be near enough to get, for example, Philadelphia, to get media coverage from Philadelphia or New York City, or if you have major affiliates, network affiliates in your town, you need to be aware of that. Okay. You also need to designate alternate facilities. What if the facility that you already plan on meeting in isn't available? What if it's part of the problem, part of the crisis? You need to have another place designated, and possibly one off-site from where from your own facilities, your own buildings, okay? And the same for the media briefing location and the monitoring center. Okay. You also need to indicate what resources you need and who's responsible for providing those or having those available and maintaining their equipment and maintaining the supplies so that they're available at a moment's notice. A couple of things, when I did a drill one time with a major national candy company, and they evacuated to another site, and they were doing quite well for a few hours, and then all their phones went dead because they didn't bring extra batteries or chargers with them. So the devil is in the details often, and that can sometimes be, the little things can be the things that really trip you up. Other resources, staff to answer and log incoming phone calls. We've talked about those before. Pitchers of water, bottled water on the podiums for spokespersons, for the media, arrangements for food and beverage in prolonged situations, access to toilets, rest areas for staff in event of prolonged situations. And you need, again, to specify the staff and alternate staff who are responsible for seeing that all of this is taken care of. You can also prepare backgrounders and draft releases in advance for each of these things, so that you've got a good part of the work already done, and then you just put in some of the details. Backgrounders, for example, if you have a building facility and you've got a problem, they're going to want to know, when was it built? Where is it located? How big is it? Whatever, what's how many rooms, whatever. And if you have that kind of information available, you just pull it out of the file. Organization. Okay, this is a suggestion that I make, because I've given you a lot of stuff here, and we need to start looking at how we put this together as a plan, how we streamline it. My suggestion is to divide it into 4 sections, okay? Part 1 would be the basics that we talked about. You need to have a table of contents for your plan with page numbers, okay? Then you can put in your purpose and goals that we discussed, the scope, and any disclaimers that you have about the fact that this is not necessarily covering everything that you could ever possibly deal with. Part 2 would be your definitions, your crisis categories, and all the different possibilities, your crisis levels, what determines crisis levels, and so forth. All right. Part 3 would be your structures, your crisis management team, your crisis communication team, and I suggest putting the crisis management team information in there because you're going to have to deal with them, and that's one way to interface to know who they are, and you're going to be working closely with them. Okay, your contact list, that includes media lists and public officials and so forth, your facilities and alternate facility information, and the resources and supplies and things that we just talked about. And finally, part 4 would cover your crisis scenarios, the description of specific situations by levels, internal communication procedures, and external communication procedures. And those we will look at in detail in the 3rd webinar. Okay, so that's my suggestion for how your plan is put together. And each of these sections, you put them in a ring binder, you use tabs on them, and it makes it very, very easy for anybody that needs to use it to be able to access the information they need. Okay, so next Wednesday, March 1st, we're going to look at communication and media guidelines. And this is a document that you actually prepare. You have it in your plan, but you actually share it with the media. Internal and external communication protocols, who talks to whom and why, policies and procedures, what policies do you need to review or revise or add, what is your criteria for selecting spokespersons, how do you respond to reporters' questions, especially when you feel like you can't say anything, social media strategies and tactics, and methods to deal with public and internet hostility. So there's going to be a lot to talk about next week. I want to thank you for participating. I have my contact information there. If you are working on a plan or want to start one, I'd be happy to talk to you about it, and we will hopefully see you next week.
All right, Carol, thank you very much. We went over by a little bit. I would like to just maybe give 30 seconds to anybody who would have a question. I want to respect everybody's time for being here on this webinar. If anybody has any questions, feel free to type it in right now. Carol, let me take over control, presenter back to my screen.
Okay.
Okay.
All right.
So now my screen is up. Otherwise, hearing no questions, I would again remind folks that if you have any questions, you're welcome to email me, or if you want to email Carol, you can. She can answer you directly, and or we can address this next week at the presentation before we go into the formal presentation. Otherwise, thank you all for being a part of this. Hope you enjoyed the webinar, and we'll see you next week. I will send out an invitation, which you need to register as you did for this one, for part 2, because it will be a different link. Thank you so much. Have a great day. Bye-bye.